So Maggie, we're here at Charleston.
My first time.
Me too, in my memory, in my living memory.
Your living memory.
What are we seeing?
It's great to be in Linder's exhibition, which is a bit of a constellation of different works, isn't it? But I guess starting here with her work, a classic photo montage, which Linder's renowned for. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really nice to see this work alongside Duncan Grant's erotic drawings, which haven't been seen before. And there's so very many of them. Because I think there's so many nice parallels, which we can get into.
Also, I feel like there's like this overtone of just indulgence in both of the spaces, and this is taking like a much more materialistic view of indulgence. So with all the like watches and roses, which are usually like, you know, roses can be thrown at you if you're celebrating something or something like this, and it's very like excess, and indulgence in that way rather than like indulging in your sexuality and like how you live your life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I suppose that draws on to the silverware series of photo montages, which again take a real maximalist approach. Like the imagery is so overlaid with like decadence and excess, which always reminds me of you and your work and your writing about maximalism as a resistance to minimalism, which I suppose is relevant here because the silverware series is looking at predominantly working class Liverpool football fans and their obsession with collecting silverware and memorabilia.
For you. Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, like when we're talking about those like themes of indulgence and maximalism, especially when they're kind of mixed with sex. Like I feel like our first instinctive approach is to be like, oh, that's gauche, or like, oh, it's too much, it's too over the top. But then I feel like the work kind of suggests that we really strip that back. Like, why do we think that it's distasteful to show sexuality, or why do we think it's distasteful for working class people to kind of pine for trinkets that are beautiful, but we so readily accept that in the upper classes? And I feel like that work is definitely having a conversation, especially within the context of the house and like all the beautiful things we are surrounded by. It's kind of like putting a hammer in that, like, wait, why do we think some things are beautiful but some things are tacky? And I feel like this set of images really does that well.
Yeah, definitely. And especially, like you say, in the context of the house, where one of the privileges that the Bloomsbury set had was, you know, coming from upper middle class, predominantly upper middle class backgrounds. And of course they faced all of the homophobia and, you know, patriarchal constraints, but they were kind of sheltered by that class privilege. So it's so nice to see it sort of played out here.
Before you even consider all the history of Charleston on its own, but it's like by putting these materials that are kind of considered like for poor people, you mostly see this kind of fleece like on a market or in like a high street shop. And the same with the watches, like they're all kind of low price point watches. And then by putting them in a gallery space, the conversation is had as to whether that elevates it or what that kind of does for this experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've also just realised it's the Jonas Brothers on this fleece.
Oh my God, is it?
I was trying to work it out earlier. I feel like that's Kevin, not to show my ass. I'm not a Jonas Brothers fan.
Yeah. But I think what it also makes me think of, which obviously you and I talk about a lot and like independently in our work too, it's like this very much feels, this work and Linder's photo montages often feel to me like an interrogation of how identity is so layered and constructed, and particularly constructed through consumption and what we buy and wear, have in our homes and use, and like what all of that comes to symbolize and mean. And the watches for me like really connote that, as well as the use of fabrics and homewares and silverware through Linder's photo montages. This cluster of 6 works are so queer, even though we might feel like Duncan Grant's drawings are less shocking now than they would have been when in the era when he was making them, when of course homosexuality was still a criminal act. That actually still censorship is a big issue, and like the policing, particularly of queer bodies, is a huge issue. Like, you know, the censorship in these images makes me think that, like, you'd probably be okay posting some of these on Instagram, say, but I'm sure you'd get into more trouble posting Duncan Grant's images. And I think that's interesting too, that like we think we've come a long way, but actually how far have we really come? Okay, so then there's these amazing photo montages, and the big large scale photo montage of Rabbit, the producer, and their queer collective House of Kenzo. And I think Linda's been working with them for a while, hasn't she? I think they have a real shared love for this kind of imagery that tears up different cultural motifs and brings it together, particularly to look at the queer and trans body in contemporary culture.
These pieces, this kind of series in particular, really draws on that kind of like hiding versus what you show, and like who you can be true to yourself with versus who you have to conceal yourself from, which kind of runs throughout the history of the house, throughout the history of Duncan Grant's work, especially the way they're so layered. And like if you peel back a layer, you get more. If you look, you get more and more of that person. If you like allow yourself to see the full picture.
Definitely.
Which I think is really important.
And I think in terms of that, like, I'm really interested in, you know, obviously in her photo montages, Linda uses a lot of silverware, a lot of food, and a lot of like this natural imagery of nature, like bugs, flowers, insects, is for me really interesting, because obviously that's like such a sticking point in the conversation about gender and transness, is like
what's
the natural order of things, and the people's conceived notions of what is and isn't a natural body, which of course as like gender abolitionists we want to like get rid of, because, you know, all bodies are natural or unnatural in different ways, and using that to police how people express themselves is where that violence stems from. So I feel like that's a really interesting imagery here.
Even just the like home in this as well is kind of contextualizing it in this way that like it's not this kind of, obviously gender can be fantastical and can be all of these things, but it's also very normal, and like we have our homes and we have our communities and we exist within all of them. And it's kind of showing this full picture of a life rather than just a little sensationalist snippet.
It also looks like it could be in Charleston.
It does.
Which is great, because it's like these sanctuaries. What's happening here in Anne-Marie O'Sullivan's screen, which is made from foraged heather from the local area. And again, Linda saw this at a Crafts Council exhibition, I believe, and was really intrigued by its locality, but also how it speaks to Charleston as this place where, you know, the community could shelter themselves from outside norms and be kind of camouflaged and masked by the appearance of a nice country farmhouse, and also the distance from different gazes that are obviously the things that make people have to hide. Or so, you know, the freedom of expression from behind this camouflage and from behind this local, you know, sanctuary that they made for themselves. I love this work because it just really epitomizes that for me, and I can see why Linda was like, yes, this needs to be right in the room.
I think it's very great as well, because it kind of like, not that any of this work needs legitimizing, but as in it's saying Charleston is as much a part of the fabric of this local community as the natural materials that are like taken from the ground. It's kind of placing them on the same level and saying, you know, this space wouldn't be what it is without the queerness, without the community, as much as we need the natural objects that kind of sprout up from it. And it really contextualizes it in that history, which I like. And yeah, I love the kind of duplicity of the hiding, but then also you can't miss it. Like it's in the middle of the room as soon as you walk in. It's right there, and it's so different. I feel like she's very camp as well.
She is. She's giving.
Looks like feathers, all the heather. Looks like kind of marabou. It's very now.
Very now.
Walking around the way that we've been able to pull things out and be like, oh, this also is in conversation with that piece of work, or is in conversation with the legacy of Duncan Grant today, and like how those works still really speak to everything that we are talking about in like current contexts around gender and sexuality. I think is really kind of to credit to Linder and all of the artists that have worked on this show.
Yeah, and Duncan Grant's legacy really, and like continued relevance in queer art today.
I think it's
sure.
great that like we're constantly reminded of our history as we're going around.
Yeah, and our present and our future. Yeah.